Welcome back. Hope you guys had a chance to catch coffee and dessert. So we're going to go into the afternoon segment of our workshop. I am going to talk a little bit about district energy life cycle that we started to touch upon this morning, and some strategies for success that we have discovered as when we start to write the report. So this is our schematic for capturing the various phases or stages of the life cycle, if you will. Some of our systems, like my system at MIT, was conceived in 1916, and I try to imagine what their visioning session may have been like. You know, they didn't have computers, they had coal, and they had a campus to run. So every project had a concept phase, moving from there and opening the valve to go into feasibility, and then design build, commissioning, and operating and maintaining the system to a standard that provides quality service is a complete journey. But then our systems age, fuel requirements change, objectives change, so we get into modernization. Many of our steam systems are undergoing modernization. We're changing fuels. We're looking at lower temperature hot waters. We are adding thermal energy storage. We're looking into CHP. So there's a lot going on in the second half of the lives of our systems. There's also renewal. You know, the items I mentioned before, and certainly expansion. In a lot of our communities, the systems are growing. Even as new systems come about, we're connecting new loads. As the chart I showed this morning, District Energy Space shows, we continue to add buildings to our reliable and quality service system. So very briefly, these are the 4 success factors that we have identified. Easy to remember. We put risk at the very top, because if we do not identify or pay attention to the risks our particular project faces and then allocate them to the right party, that will stay with us for the rest of the journey, and not a pleasant piece of luggage to carry around. We put up information because without the right quality of information, granted that at the concept stage, information is preliminary, people are fuzzy about their build-outs, they don't know what the building mix is going to be, they don't know if there's going to be an anchor tenant, who's going to be the anchor tenant. But as we move through the phases, we need to refine the quality of information. There are a lot of sources, community action plans, there are zoning plans, developers, projects that are in the pipeline to get permits. There's a variety of information sources that one can leverage. We also talked briefly about energy mapping, knowing your base inventory. Where are your sources? Where are your sinks? Do you have a heat sink possibility? Do you have a data center which has a cooling thermal load but then can serve to offload its heat to a neighboring system? So these are important exercises along with feasibility. And money, we talk about money, you know, there's many different kinds of money. They all come at different prices. Different people charge different rates for their money, but getting the appropriate level of funding is determined by the life cycle stage. We'll get more into that later. And then people, we wanted to emphasize the role of people. We heard champion mentioned. You know, a lot of district energy systems, if you really look at their journeys, there was a champion, a persistent, passionate person. I'm just talking to Tom Octera in Westminster, Colorado. He's been working to put a district energy system now for 5 years. And every phone call I have with him is filled with passion. Laxmi, I want to do this. I want to make sure that I get the piping right. And we forget how many small champions and large champions and stakeholders like the city council, your mayor, the mayor of Pittsburgh, for example, is a leading example of how much of a bully pulpit a mayor can use. And in the UK, for example, we have many people champion the cause. And need to have people who know how to do district energy. If you get somebody who thinks it's a great idea and it's cool, you want to look at projects they have done and their expertise, because designing things wrong or making wrong assumptions is setting up for failure. And then during these other phases, our staff, as Jim Lodge will tell you, our staff can either make or break a day. You know, every day they have routine work, but on a day when there is a crisis is when their character comes through. And these are people who come into work at 5 or 7 a.m. to do shutdowns, and they throw those breakers, and they're just amazing people that deal with steam, chilled water, and thermal energy storage, and we must try to take our hats off to them every time we see them. I know on my own campus, my steam fitters are really precious people, so I want you to not forget people. And then we have a bunch of tools. You had some handouts earlier this morning. We put together a few tools as part of our report. We've also listed a ton of tools that you can leverage. All of this information is available in great detail in our report. So I want to just highlight some of the characteristics of some of these stages. In the concept stage, it's often municipalities, cities, towns, and developers who try to look at certain objectives. We've talked about environmental, social, developmental objectives. Then there's also the planning staff, the public works staff, and other experts on transportation who are trying to get a cohesive community that provides a good energy infrastructure, but also provides good quality of life for its companies and its citizens. There's also opportunities for not just greenfield districts, but rejuvenation of brownfield sites, or for example, in Pittsburgh, where there is the Almono project, there's a bunch of Navy yards that are being repurposed. Hudson Yards in New York is another example of rejuvenating our urban sites that have served a purpose in the past, but now can be repurposed. Some of the risky characteristics are that you don't have all the information. You're still in concept stage. You're still trying to figure out which objectives to cull out of the many objectives that the stakeholders bring, and how are you going to carry them through your project. We may not have anchor loads. We don't know what the build-out is going to be, and you certainly don't have money at this stage. So you've got to be creative. Feasibility, IDA has helped with a lot of feasibility studies. We have a lot of service providers that do this. The Department of Energy has helped with this. This phase refines your project. It puts boundaries on them. And this is where you look at your options. Should I put in thermal energy storage? What size CHP will really help me cover my base load, and how do I address peaks? This is also where you don't have enough information about phasing. All your assumptions that you make here will need to be vetted and tested, and some kind of crash testing needs to be done. You have to make sure that you're beginning to think about money. Design build phase, of course, the engineers will play a role here, but at the same time, you need to make sure that the procurement side is covered, so that they're not out of phase, that your construction and your procurement phases are aligned. Can't forget commissioning, because commissioning determines whether design criteria are met. You want to do this before the customer gets involved, and then they're not getting the temperatures they require. All of the risks in this phase will affect system performance, but naturally also your CapEx and OpEx, And then you may not get the money in time, so you have to have contingencies in your project. Sometimes you run into interconnection and right-of-way issues. So this is the phase where you want to leave the project, but you have to stay the course and work it out. I was talking to Bruce Onder this morning and saying, more and more of us realize that while the engineering and the technical side is important, it's the art of crafting your project so it moves forward at the momentum that you need it to have. Operations maintenance, can't say enough. We have to set aside money and resources to do this piece. A system will degrade very fast if you don't pay attention to this, and it has an immediate impact on your customers. And if you have contracts that specify performance, this aspect can't be missed. Training your staffs, as Rob would say, send them to IDA conferences, or especially if they come to your neck of the woods. There are webinars. There's a whole lot of videos these days, so there's a lot of information that will help our folks, O&M folks, do their jobs well. Expansion, this is, we're beginning to see this on campuses a lot. My own campus is expanding. Campuses seem to just be able to grow within their 150 acres to densities that I had not imagined. But certainly there's growth in downtown systems with new buildings being connected, and hospitals are growing. So getting the sizing right and making sure that your expansion portion integrates into the existing base. I know Juan Ontiveros is in constant state of expansion. So there's a lot of experts here in this room who know how to change a tire on a moving car. And so that's where expansion puts in. You can't shut down. And if you can imagine doing this in Manhattan, then your imagination runs vivid. So here too, you have to plan for interruptions. Money will be needed, but this is already a de-risk system, so your chances of getting finances certainly improve. We talked about renewal. This has to come with aging systems. Our systems last for decades. Some of our condensate and pipe is decades old. Our chillers have long lives, unlike building level chillers, district chillers, because of the way they're designed and the way they're maintained, and they run it, they're not part load most of the time. They have long lives. And so, but they all do reach end of life, and we need to renew them. And this is a window of opportunity to modernize and look at options for greater efficiency and lower carbon-based technologies. I think I went the wrong way. We talked about modernization. I think we get that. What's doing the rounds is steam to hot water these days, but one has to look carefully as to what extent that's possible, what's the price tag, and what's the impact. Putting up CHP, more and more renewables being integrated. Thermal energy storage is a source of thermal resilience. If you lose power and you made the ice or chilled water the night before, you have a battery, a thermal battery that helps you through the next day. I say when I go to a microgrid, give a microgrid talk, I say, we've had batteries, thermal batteries, for many, many years. We just don't seem to think of them as batteries. So thermal energy storage is certainly gaining ground. Acquisition and sale. This has also been happening in the last 10 or 15 years, where we see in the private sector primarily that Enwave was sold to Brookfield. There are other examples of acquisitions, and by this point the projects are very, very de-risked. It's all profit from there on, if they're well maintained, and they can command a good price. As in Toronto, Enwave, the city of Toronto made 168 million Canadian dollars on their original investment. So for a city, that's big bucks. This is a table that I will refer you to in the report. It's something that I think, Michael, you did some of the work on this. It's helpful in that it gives you some guidelines. The report is meant to be a guide. It gives you some guidelines as to, depending on what stage you're in that flight path for your project, what are some of the data needs? It's a checklist of sorts. Who should you have at the table, and who are the supporting groups? I encourage you to read this, because at any stage in the activity, it's good to know that you've covered all bases. And so for each part of the district energy life cycle, you'll find valuable tips along these dimensions. I wanted to get through my few minutes of setting context so I can get to our wonderful panel here. Jim Lodge should introduce them. So right here from Phoenix, we have Jim Lodge from NRG. I've known Jim for a long time. Jim is currently Vice President, Strategy and Business Development at NRG Energy, and within the Business Systems Division of NRG Energy, and he oversees all of NRG's district energy business development efforts. Jim brings more than 30 years of experience in the energy industry in executive management, business development, strategic planning, P&L, and operations responsibilities. Jim is a graduate of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in electrical engineering, I didn't know that, and received an MBA from Arizona State University in finance. He serves on the executive committee of IDEA and is a registered professional engineer. Welcome, Jim. To Jim's left, I have Suresh Jambunathan. Suresh is a director of business development at Veolia North America, and he has designed and commissioned process plants, dairy, meat, poultry, and developed energy recycling projects across several industries, including food processing, ethanol, carbon black, bulk chemicals, and industrial gases. His experience extends across process engineering, project management, business development, and he holds a BE in petrochemical engineering and an MS in food science from Penn State. And last but not least, my dear friend Ken Smith from Evergreen Energy. I've also known Ken for a long time. Ken is the president and CEO of District Energy St. Paul. Some of you may have been at our conference in St. Paul recently. He is a professional engineer and an MBA, and he, as I said, is the lead at District Energy St. Paul. It's internationally acclaimed community energy system in St. Paul, much written about, not in our report because it's so much written about, but we also have Ken and Nina Axelson and Micah Hearn here from Evergreen Energy. So they have done the journey on many fronts, so I encourage you to catch up with them if you have a chance. Ken served previously as Executive Vice President, Chief Operating Officer of Evergreen and District Energy St. Paul. He has a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering from North Dakota State University and a master's in business administration from University of St. Thomas in Minneapolis, Minnesota. So I'd like you to give them a round of applause. They're very busy people. So I prepared some questions for the panel, and I'm going to start off by asking them, because this was a segment on the life cycle, and I know they have all seen their systems journey through this life cycle. So as we all know, all of this can take time, years sometimes. So as experienced leaders in this district energy development arena, what are some of the insights and words of advice you're willing to share with those who are thinking about putting their toes in district energy waters, whether it be for a greenfield or brownfield site? I'll start with Ken, who's laughing at the far end of the. Is your mic on?
Well, I was laughing because you really don't put your toes into district energy. You're kind of all in to make it go. And thinking about this question, I really thought about 4 words: patience, we can come back to that one, partnership, leadership, and pathway. And starting with partnership, it takes a lot of collaboration to get a system off the ground, a greenfield, brownfield, and depending upon if it's a campus or for some kind of a private development, that makeup can be quite extensive. And so it takes a lot of collaboration, a lot of partnership, and through that life cycle that Laxmi was showing, it can change from the beginning through the process to the end. Who is important to have involved at the beginning may have a lesser role as you move through that development cycle. But it takes tremendous amount of collaboration and partnership. with many different groups of people and organizations beyond your client or the customer of the overall system. Leadership, you mentioned that, the idea that this champion, you cannot underestimate that. The importance of having a champion or local leadership, somebody that is going to be there, that believes in it, that's going to put their reputation on the line to move it forward. And if we come across a project or development that does not have that, we literally will set it aside until it does, because it just will not move forward. And sometimes it takes a while for that to come to fruition. And then pathway, do they have a good plan? Is there a good plan? And oftentimes you find that folks think they know what success looks like until you get them all around a table and say, do you all agree what success looks like? And many times they have different opinions of what success looks like. So if you don't have that, you need to start there. Make sure that you have an agreement on what success looks like among the key players, and that will help you lead forward what your pathway is for your overall project. And then the last I had on this was patience. There's projects that we've been engaged in that had 9 lives, in some cases more than that. They've died and come back and died and come back and died and come back. And we've got one right now that we wrote off probably 5 times, and it's gonna go now. And so it takes a lot of patience and to stick with it. So perseverance is my favorite word. You need a lot of perseverance in this business.
Well put, well put. Suresh, anything to add?
Thank you. I think Ken summarized it really well. And the last word, perseverance. They say, if you succeed, you're persistent. If you failed, you're obstinate. But jokes aside, really, the high-level thing I can add is, when you're starting something which has so many unknowns, it just helps to sit back and think. And when I say think, just take a sheet of paper, pencil, and just write down, make the effort of putting pencil to paper and say, what do I know? What do I need to know? What commercial commitments do I need to make this project a go? Meaning, what are the commercial hurdles I need to jump over? What are the legal pathways I need to skirt around? What technical options do I need to worry about? Which people do I need to talk to? Ken mentioned champion. Who are the champions? But on the other hand, who are the people who might oppose the project and why? What are their motivations? Just that effort of thinking is very hard. Thinking is very hard. But the effort of putting that down evolves into a plan, a business plan, so to speak. There are a lot of fancy MBA terms one can use, but fundamentally, what is my strategy from where I am today to where I want to go? And then, like Ken said, just jump in. And it's an iterative process. It's like herding cats. And you have 9 bad days for every good day. And you just have to tell yourself, the sun's still going to rise tomorrow, whether I succeed or not today. So.
Thank you. Jim?
Can you guys hear me okay? Yeah. Couple things I would add. I think what they touched upon a lot was sort of laying the foundation to be able to actually just get something off the ground. I'll touch upon maybe a little bit, maybe that next step along the way of the implementation. And I think, first of all, just as a developer, you've got to make sure that your executives are aligned with what the long-term goals are, because, this is years in the making, and it never turns out the way you thought it was going to turn out. And I can remember early on when we were developing the Phoenix system here, we were successful in having dramatic growth. We timed it really, really well with respect to the development in downtown Phoenix. However, what I kept getting from our chairman of the board was, well, you keep taking that carrot and you keep pulling it further and further away, because we would have another opportunity. So I'd say we need more capital because we need to extend the pipeline. And so that return that they were looking at getting, I was continuing to stretch that out as I was continuing to throw more capital into the ground. So I think, again, from a perspective of being aligned and really understanding the philosophy and the business model, I think is really important. Couple other things that I'd say, and you touched upon it a little bit, Laxmi, was scale. You know, I really do believe you do need to have an anchor customer. You have to have that, because the challenge is you're never gonna, well, I shouldn't say never. I mean, it would be an ideal project if you had all 10,000 tons or whatever amount of steam you're gonna sell, and they're already all signed up and they're all gonna come on at the exact same time. That'd be a beautiful thing. It just doesn't happen. And so, you know, when you sort of think about this, you're putting a bunch of money into the ground, and it's not linear. So we talk about phases and expansions, and that's all great and it sounds good, but you know, really when you look at it incrementally, you're still putting a whole bunch of money in right at the very beginning. And so you have to sort of understand that when you go in, and to have somebody that is an anchor, you really have to have that to begin with. And then also, you know, I think you mentioned about the data collection. Having a really good vibe for what's going on in the development community, as well as the existing buildings. You know, what we found, again, I really focus on the Phoenix system that we have here. We did do some retrofits, but retrofits are a lot harder than brand new buildings. Just the economics and everything. It's just, not to mention, there's people that are running those buildings that maybe feel a little uncomfortable, that somebody else is coming in as a third party to step in a little bit to what maybe they're doing, even though 9 times out of 10 they get reallocated to something else. So I think a real good understanding of the marketplace also, and the age of the equipment, and then the competitive price. You got to obviously make sure that you price this thing up right so that it's going to be competitive. And then I guess the last thing that I would just say is, you know, with the contractors and the consulting engineers, you know, there's unique aspects, and I'm thinking downtown areas or even campuses of contractors that have done work at those locations. And I would just say it's really important to, you know, you can have a lot of good contractors in your community, but if they're knowledgeable on what's in the streets, you know, and what they're, because you can do a lot of work in you know, checking out the utilities and looking at old drawings, and the reality is you're going to find stuff that nobody knew about. But if a contractor's already been in there digging up, they already know what streets are good streets, what streets are bad streets, which ones to avoid, and so forth. So I think getting people that are also used to working with the cities. I mean, if you think about that too, if you don't have a contractor that works well with the city, it gets really difficult. Traffic control and all those things can really add to the cost. So lots of moving parts.
Yeah, you can see that they've all been in the trenches. This piece about the contractors, this is the first time I've heard it, is, you know, if they know where it's safe to dig, the dig safe guys, and they know how to work with city folks, I think that actually helps you move projects forward. So I want to keep with what you just said, Jim, you know, and Ken, you said too. Let's say we have an anchor tenant, but then we still don't have the full build out. You know, we still have to put more capacity and pipe in the ground than just for the anchor tenant. So what are some of the strategies? Anna mentioned nodal development, and that people talk about satellite plants. Have you tried any of these strategies to help align your capital with the building phase out of your system? What do people do when there's misalignment beyond the anchor tenant?
Well, yes.
Yes.
So we've had situations where you knew an area was going to develop and would put some kind of a satellite facility in that location, or our CFO would say, we've been servicing this temporary chiller for 15 years. When are we ever going to get done with servicing this temporary chiller? I thought we were going to connect it up by now. And so that happens. It is, in some cases, looking at how do you build your trunk lines that can service the need for the anchor tenant, but then has the capacity to expand. You want to limit how much capital you put in the ground. As Jim said, you know, think about how do you phase it, how do you expand it at the right time, and minimize the risk that you have with so much capital in the ground. And if it doesn't come to fruition, that's a challenge for the business. So one of the things that's really important is looking at the design of your distribution system. Is it over-designed? And you see that. And one of the things that's really important that we use as a strategy is to get our operations staff involved in our design, in our design review, so that what we put in is maintainable. We can think about, do we have the right capacity at the right time? Is whatever you put in the ground, you're going to have to operate and maintain, and think about, when I'm connecting up customers, how am I going to reconfigure the system in an off-normal configuration in order to add on additional customers. So those are all very important things as you're designing your systems.
Very helpful. And either of you want to add? Jim, Suresh?
I'll add just a little bit to that. You know, it is a challenge when you have, and it's Murphy's Law, right? With that, when you add that next building, instead of being right there on the distribution, it's 3 blocks away. And oh, by the way, they're talking about other development that's in between where you are now and where you want to go. And so it is interesting on looking at, and we've done similar things, is looking at, well, do I add capacity on one end, or do I, if I've already got capacity already, it's sort of hard to decide then, do I really want to add more capacity at another location, which many times can be much more expensive because then you're bringing more infrastructure in and all the things that you have to do to develop another plant. And sometimes you have to take calculated risks, and that gets back to sort of understanding the marketplace and the development community to have a sense. I mean, there's no, I mean, that's why, you know, it's interesting, our company, you know, we say, well, we're not developers, we don't take risk. And I'm like, really? I mean, we do all the time.
Right.
And we, you know, but it's calculated risk, and I can say that on sometimes it doesn't work out. In fact, you know, if you look at any of you that are on our tour, or you see the map that we have out there on our distribution, there's one part that doesn't have hardly any density. And that was pipe that was actually put in at the very beginning to serve some buildings that we sort of had to have as part of the mass. And then you look at the denser areas, those were ones that we took a calculated risk on because we had to go several blocks to get to a particular customer, and it actually filled in. We were very successful. So it is sort of there's a balancing act. Sometimes it doesn't turn out quite the way you wanted, and other times it works out really well.
Any insights from Veolia?
No, I think the two gentlemen on either side pretty much summed it up. The only thing I'll add again is the comment. It's a strategic decision, and one of the key things is on the anchor tenant. You look at the anchor tenant and try to estimate, or guesstimate is a better word, what fraction of your total cash flow do they represent? Do they at least, at the very minimal, represent positive cash flow? Because then, as you add more customers, the marginal profitability of those customers can be high. But you know, and the art and a judgment, the science, of course. You have to, you know, be a very rigorous analysis, and then you sit back and ask yourself, I've done a lot of analysis. What does my gut tell me? And that's the risk part. And risk is ultimately, you know, managing probabilities. So.
Thank you, thank you. Since we've gotten into money matters, you know, I think it's very important, the point that you raised is what percentage of the anchor customer, the revenue that the anchor customer generates, what percentage of your total cash flow is that? Because you might get an anchor customer whose scale and demand is not big enough, which might mean you need more anchor customers. So, you know, I think that's a good part of the analysis that needs to be developed. The cash flow, how long will they stay, when are they going to come on the scene? So, talking about money a little bit, you know, we've talked about types of funds, you know, private equity, debt, financing, grants. What are some of the financing tools you've used to fund your system? Have you found that the projects are more bankable with certain kinds of investors, and are their expectations very different? Does it help that you have a city partner with you as you take your you know, case to the lending institution? So shed some light on what kind of courage and analysis does it take to go to the bank and come back with the positive outcome? Yeah.
I'll start. So I think there's depending upon, again, whether this is your first rodeo or not, probably makes a big difference. And so I would say that if it is, then I think partnering with someone that has some of that experience and expertise helps a lot, because I think the financing institutions, you know, they want to know, have you been successful in the past and what's your track record been? So I think that's really, really important. But probably even more important than that, too, is the contracts that you have and the quality off-takers. I mean, they're going to want to look at those entities and say, okay, you know, we're only as good as the cash flow that comes in, and so we're going to want to make sure that those contracts not only are good with the off-taker, but also what are some of the terms of those contracts. You know, one of the biggest things that comes through is, you know, fuel costs, and are you protecting yourself? If it's going to be a 20-year plus kind of agreement, then a lot of strange things can happen over that period of time, and so they're going to want to feel confident about the correlation that you have to any escalations with respect to that. So I think those are a couple key things. And then, of course, how much money or equity that you're willing to bring in obviously makes a difference. And then there's just the relationships with the financial institutions. And again, if you've done some work with them already in the past, then they're knowledgeable about district energy, and you definitely want to get those, because if they're not, you can spend an awful lot of time trying to just communicate what district energy is. So there's a number of them that are out there that are experienced in this, and so you don't have to go down that whole path of that discussion.
Helpful. Anything to add, Ken?
Yeah, I think I would concur with that. One of the most important things a financier looks for is quote-unquote certainty. They'll get the money back. I mean, everything else is wonderful, but will I get my money back once I invest it? And revenue certainty, the length of the contract, the number of contracts, the diversity of contracts, those are all important factors. The more diverse, the less chance that when one contract fails, which can happen, does happen, the rest of the pro forma top line melts away. Another really important factor is how is the overall deal structured? Is it a pass-through where you get paid for putting a Picasso on your wall? Well, you know, that doesn't really incentivize efficiency. Or is there a commercial structure where all the parties are equally incentivized to maximize profit, minimize cost, or not minimize, but to optimize cost? You know, use that distinction carefully. You don't want to just minimize cost. You want to optimize cost, because by optimizing your cost and maximizing your revenue, you maximize your profits over the long term. So the commercial structure and the shape of revenue certainty, I believe, are the two most important factors, among the two most important factors that determine the type of financing and the cost of that financing.
Thank you.
I would agree with all those. I think you touched on it, Suresh, is the diversity of the customer base is really important. So the credit worthiness that they have, do you have too many eggs in one basket? So if you have a lot of government customers, well, that can be good. But if you have a lot of private, do you have some diversity in their mix to make sure that you have some good credit worthiness? And you know, one thing that you can't underestimate, and this is you know, what Jim mentioned, is the experience level. Have you done this before? This may be your first rodeo, but you've got partners that it's not. So have they been there? Do they know what they're doing, not only to develop it and get it financed, but do they know how to operate it for the long term, that you're going to have success once the system is up and running?
Well, thank you very much. I hope you all found that useful. I took notes. Hopefully, if we do a sequel to the report, some of this will go in. We have not had too much time for questions from the audience, so I'd like you all to use the opportunity to ask the questions. Please come up to the mic, and I'd like to give a few minutes of our time to questions. Anyone? Here we go.
In the early session, we heard some interesting bits about how you make the case to new clients. So we're interested in, we've got our district energy system down the road. We'd like to be able to expand it to new clients, private sector, municipality, maybe provincial government. And so just tips on how you do that, how you justify the costs, how you do the presentation where you're comparing the costs of when vendors are talking about putting a system in the building versus getting connected to the system.
I'll go ahead and maybe just respond first. I try to avoid talking about price as long as I possibly can. But for some good reasons, too. One of them is you want to be able to sell the value of district energy, and I think too often, especially as engineers, we tend to want to jump right into the numbers, and I really think that should be avoided. The assumptions are so littered with assumptions and 20-year kinds of assumptions, and most people don't have any idea what their costs are for that long haul. And so therefore,
Yep.
frankly, if they want district energy, they'll figure out a way to make the numbers work. And I'm not saying they're going to like change them to make them so that they're completely wrong and they're just doing it as a, not a legitimate way to be able to justify the project. But certainly, when they're looking at this, if the decision maker and these influencers want district energy, that goes a long way. Because at the end of the day, if you don't spend the time doing that and they don't want it, I don't care what numbers that you provide, they will find a way to kill it. So I would say that's one right away. I think the other thing that's great is if you can have referrals or people that you can take prospective customers to go see that are similar. And it's sort of interesting. If it's a hotel, they want to see other hotels, even though, mechanically, what's the difference, right? But that's true. That's what they want to do. So if we have those, and in the early years of a brand new system, then it's much harder because if it's something brand new to people, you think about it, you're going to a third party and the heating, cooling is critical to their business. They're going to be very uncomfortable with that at first. So even if you can take them to someone else, either another district energy system that is very similar to maybe what you're looking at developing, I think that's another path. When we developed the Phoenix system, at the time we were part of, and some of you may know, the Unicom systems that were in Chicago at that time. And we partnered with them because we didn't have the expertise. And so we were literally taking people from Phoenix, and we were going to do thermal storage on ice storage. And the problem with that was during that period of time, the utilities had promoted that, and these commercial buildings had put it in, and they didn't work. And so here I am saying, hey, we're going to put this great district energy system. By the way, we're going to have ice storage. And they look at me like, what? This isn't going to be reliable. So, I think those are key things. So what we did is we took them to Chicago. There was a system in Chicago at that time. And we took them there and we said, look, let us show you what we're going to do here in Phoenix. It's going to be the same thing. And I think that was very helpful.
Mm-hmm. I think if Rob were here, he would say, IDA provides so many opportunities and makes it possible for folks to visit our many systems. People open their doors, you have you have Veolia and many of our cities, and NRG, of course. They're more than happy to showcase quality district energy systems. And then we have, at our conferences, we have case studies. So I think the educational aspect at the early stages of getting that warm and fuzzy feeling, like I want to be like Copenhagen, or I want to do what Paris did. I think those are the reasons that provide access to that small premium, because we can't fight the assumptions. They're spreadsheets, loads of assumptions, and whose cost numbers do we believe? So I want to give a plug for the educational aspects we have.
I would agree. Your best salespeople are oftentimes our customers, and not just within that community, but in others. And so I think that's very important. Folks want to touch it, they want to feel it. We've done things to set up mechanical rooms, or we know certain customers that have just do a great job with their systems, and they will open their doors and allow folks to come in and tour and just understand and leave the room. Let them talk customer to customer, prospective customer to customer. What's been their experience? The numbers are important, but you've got to get them to want it. I think the other thing is understanding right out of the gate what's important to them. What's important to a hospital is a lot different than maybe what's important to a hotel. It really depends upon the customer and understanding what's important to them and making sure that you're covering that in whatever value proposition they're putting in front of them.
Anything to add?
I'm just going to be adding on, essentially, yes, but my perspective on that is similar in that there's a qualitative aspect and the quantitative aspect. I was trained as an engineer in India, and it's a very, very rigorous way of getting trained. We often, now that I do more business development, it was very, very hard for me to get away from numbers and focus more on the feeling, the soft stuff. When someone sees, here's district heating, they may have no idea what you're talking about. A lot of people use the words resiliency, sustainability, and it means whatever they want it to mean. And just talking to a customer, asking them, as Jim said, don't talk about price. Ask them about value, understand what the goals are, and then clarify when they say something, what does it really mean? That back and forth process is very, very revealing, and it's really hard, especially for me, not to, hey, I have a solution for you. Because that's what most engineers want to do. But it's really important to hold back and hear the customer out. And the type of customer. A conversation with a CEO is very different from a conversation with the operator. They have different needs. The CEO is worried about keeping the shareholders happy. The operator in the night shift just wants to make sure his shift runs well and he doesn't get penalized for letting a piece of equipment fail. Having that conversation, asking questions, and finally when you got a lot of feedback, go back and say, here's what I heard your goals are. Here's how I understood them. Here are a couple of options that make sense based on what you told me. And I think this will work. This is a structure, we can make it work. Are you interested? And getting that commitment, it doesn't have to be in writing, but at least, yes, I'm interested, and here's how I will go forward. Getting that is really, really important because most people will stick by what they said. But you don't ask them, hey, are you going to work with me? You're just analyzing and spreading up your spreadsheets with data.
Questions?
Hi, I've kind of got two questions. One, which banks or financial entities have experience with this that's warm and fuzzy? And what projects have included like solar energy, maybe combined with heating and cooling, and extended storage if possible?
What was the second question?
About solar energy, if it can be combined with like what they call CSP, combined solar power with bottom cycling heating and cooling and possibly extended storage.
So you're interested in knowing which banks understand district energy, willing to fund projects, and then you want to know where solar energy fits in integration with our district energy assets.
And what kind of experience is out there, if any?
Okay, well, we have some experience with that here,
Do you want to get that?
the integration. I don't know if we can name banks, but
So there's a lot of different banks. There's certainly U.S. banks that are engaged in this market, small to mid-size. We've worked with a number of different banks and European banks. So I would say, for the most part, what we work with is U.S. banks, names you would recognize, and Canadian and European. On the project side, you certainly can integrate solar. We have integrated solar. We've integrated solar thermal into our system in St. Paul. We've also there's a program called Community Solar Gardens, where basically you procure a certain amount of solar energy, and we've, in the system in St. Paul, have now we're on our way to roughly 1/3 of all of our electricity needs will be from solar. So you can integrate it in with storage as well. We have a part of our long-term planning, at least for that particular system, is to be able to access when prices of power are low, because there's excess on the grid, whether it is wind or solar, that we want to store that as thermal energy. And we're just prepared for when we can access the markets and make that happen.
Anyone else?
Sure. About financing, there are many entities. There's some big, what I would call infrastructure banks. There are specialized private equity funds that will invest, take risk in the early stage, and then there are the large pension funds, giant pools of capital, who will, after the project is up and running, they will help refinance at lower rate. So depending on where the project is at, there's a lot of money available from different people. The second part of your question, if I understood correctly, about integrating solar or renewable, perhaps, is what you were now thinking about. Solar is an example of renewable energy that can be part of what I would call a supply side. And it makes economic sense to actually include batteries. Tesla released a Powerwall. The price of solar panels is coming down. The price of batteries is coming down. So solar is one more component of our overall system. And when technically you can come up with a million combinations. A little more challenging is, given a specific set of circumstances in one geography, one location, one contracting structure, commercial structure, whether you're in St. Paul or in Arizona or in Phoenix, the economics can vary all over the place. So I'm not trying to avoid answering a question, but it really depends on which assumptions do we agree on before coming to a specific point of view.
I don't think I can add any more on the financial side, but it's sort of interesting on the renewable side. There's a couple things that I'll just comment on. We have not been successful on being able to incorporate a lot of the renewables just because our customers are so focused on the price side of things, and we haven't seen the kinds of returns, and it depends upon the location and where you're at as whether that might be economical or not. But what's interesting, and I'll just tell you about one that we tried to look at and make work, and we looked at batteries as a possibility, and it's sort of an interesting concept. Maybe others have thought about it and been more successful at making the numbers work. But on our system in Phoenix, we've got thermal storage. And so it's sort of interesting because when you look at, and it gets back to the microgrids and so forth too, where we look at trying to match both the thermal and the electrical together. And, at one of our facilities is at the convention center, and I think that's where you actually put your solar panels, right, in St. Paul on the roof there. And we've looked at the roof areas, and I think we were up to even maybe as much as 2 megawatts that we could put up on all the roof space that they have. And of course, they don't have, well, they do have cooling towers on part of the roofs, but most of it that they don't, so it's clear space. But our challenge is the kilowatt hour. The utility in Arizona has done a great job of keeping the kilowatt hour incremental costs down. So it makes it very difficult, even with the depressed prices on the solar, to be able to make the numbers work. So then we're looking at, well, how about the demand side, electrical demand side, and can we use the solar there? And oh, by the way, Phoenix would probably be of all places where you ought to be able to make this work. But if you do have a cloudy day, then our thought was, okay, well, we could potentially use battery storage, or we could use a thermal storage and shut down an electric chiller and turn around and use the thermal storage. Problem is, if we've optimized our production costs, we're utilizing all that thermal storage. Yeah. So it makes it more difficult to really make the numbers work and put that all together. And then the last thing I would say is, we are fortunate the convention center's right there, but in a lot of downtown areas, there's no space to put panels. So that's the other difficulty, the thing to make it meaningful, where do you find the space? And then the last thing I would just say is we have tried, and this is something we're still kicking around with the city of Phoenix right now, is actually putting solar panels. We know that ultimately it elevates the price a little bit, but we're thinking some of our customers may be willing to actually pay for that. So there is an opportunity for us to be able to blend those in. We'd love to be able to do it and be able to market it from that perspective if people are interested. And so that's sort of where we're at now. We haven't closed the book on it, but we're sort of in that continued evaluation stage, and maybe with battery prices coming down too, that could be helpful.
So if I could just add to that, it's often very effective, cost effective, to add, say, solar panels when you're doing a new build. It's often very, very cost ineffective to do a retrofit. It's cheaper. The retrofit payback is cheaper and faster in California, as an example, as compared to Arizona. So it just goes back to the comment earlier. a decision one way or the other depends on which assumptions are true for a given location.
Yes, thank you. I think we're coming to the close, unless there are any other questions. What I wanted to end by saying is that where feasible, district energy actually provides a pathway to integration of renewables at scale, because, again, coming back to scale, if we're going to solve the climate problem, we have to start thinking scale, and district energy really is at scale. I wish I could have hot water at my home, in my basement, in cold Massachusetts, but we are looking, some of our principles are scale, flexibility, ability to plug and play, like I showed the data center earlier. They had a resource like waste heat. They had a district heating system going by, like a river runs by, and they were able to hook in. So the future, I think, is going to be thermal networks, different sources and sinks and partnerships, and doing it right. And there are many banks. I wanted to say community banks from your community often rise to occasion. They've done so in the PV world, for example. Once they get to know what the product is. And so we're finding more and more people from the finance area coming to our conferences, which is a good sign. So Ken, go ahead.
I would just like to add one thing to what Laxmi said. There's been some work that's going on right now in DOE. There's an accelerator, actually, and it's looking at net zero districts, communities, neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. And that really came out of a conversation that happened between NREL, Rocky Mountain Institute, and the Center for Sustainable Building Research and DOE, Sustainable Building Research at the University of Minnesota. They had independently modeled, RMI, NREL, and the University of Minnesota independently modeled that if you were to integrate thermal and electric, then you can get to net zero in neighborhoods and districts. If you try to do it on a building by building basis, it's very, very, very difficult and very expensive. But by efficiency in the buildings, and you can get to 30 to 50% reduction, increase in efficiency, by putting solar where it makes sense and other renewables, and then integrate thermally, you can get to net zero, and you can do it cost effectively.
We have one more question, so we'll take that.
So my question is on partnerships with municipalities. I know with St. Paul, you guys had to do this, and you go through a process where you have to find a champion, you go through an initial study to investigate the feasibility, then you have to go to the front engineering and design phase. At what phase should you switch your focus into procuring PPA agreements for a 20 to 30-year term with your anchor tenants and your private tenants, and focus on that side of the business versus massaging the municipality into being able to put the project together at the end of the day? Where should you put your time and resources?
I'm having a hard time hearing you. Could you say that?
So when should you switch your focus from the municipality to your anchor tenants and your private tenants along the district energy system? Because you do have to lock those in to get your financing down the way. So which point should you do that at? Is that after your pre-feasibility, at your feed study point, or after you've already had the municipality commit?
Well, it depends upon the players. We would look at it after the pre-feasibility or the feasibility, if you will, and that's when we move into from feasible to financeable. That's, I think, where is the phase that you need to be looking at that. And I would, in the next presentation, actually is going to be talking about those
Right.
very topics. But that's where I would. It's at that time where you're moving from it's feasible, you have an opportunity here. Now, how do you put the various pieces together to make it move into financeable?
And it doesn't hurt to start wooing customers. You should start talking to large building owners, hotels, that, we're thinking of building a district energy system. Would you like to be one of our customers? So I was talking to somebody from Hong Kong, and they actually had lined up customers long before their seawater district cooling, which is, you can imagine, that's a one-off, very, innovative. But these people want it to be, if you're going to build it and you're ready, then it makes it that much easier because they know you. They've had that conversation. They've maybe gotten a little education. So customers, anytime you think there's a potential customer, you should engage. So with that, I'd like to invite.
Let me add
Yeah,
one more perspective. And this is truly a personal opinion. in a big company like Veolia, decisions are very rigorous. That's one way to put it. I personally believe in business. If you think of yourself as an operating company, that's determines how you operate. If you think of yourself as a development company, you have to be very quick and nimble. And one of the most important things is getting revenue certainty. That means getting commitment, quote unquote, from a prospective customer. Yeah, if you give this to me, that in this price range or this service level, I'm willing to sign up. It's not a hard and fast, it's not a contract that you get sued for if you don't follow through, but it's a pretty good commitment. It's called letter of intent, or something like that. Once you get something like that, now you go back to the municipality, everybody else, and say, look, I've got these guys that are interested. Can you help me make this happen? This means 10 new jobs. It means so much more economic development. It's a bit of an iterative process. As a developer, you have to wear multiple hats, wear them simultaneously, and have a little bit of audacity, I guess, for lack of a better word.
Here, here. So let's thank our panelists. They have given us a lot of useful information.